What if the most dangerous man in the region spent years thinking his own wife was useless in a kitchen, right up until the night she saved his life with a pot of stew? Because that's exactly what happened. And by the end of it, she didn't just win over him. She won over his entire empire. Let me tell you how. Dario Fontaine did not tolerate mistakes. Not from his men, not from his suppliers, and absolutely not on a night when the 5 most dangerous families in the region were about to walk through his front door. Tonight was supposed to be simple. A dinner, good wine, good food, quiet words traded over expensive plates, and by midnight, a brand new alliance sealed without a single shot fired. Dario had been planning it for 3 months. Every detail mattered: the seating, the lighting, the music, and above all, the food. And then, 40 minutes before the first car crested the hill, his head chef collapsed on the kitchen floor. "He's burning up," the housekeeper said, kneeling beside him, panic cracking her voice. "He was fine an hour ago, then he just went pale and started shaking." Nobody knew yet that the seafood delivered that morning had spent too long in a truck with a broken refrigeration unit. Nobody knew a supplier's lazy shortcut was about to become the most dangerous secret in the house. All anyone knew was that the man responsible for tonight's 15-course dinner was being carried out on a stretcher, groaning, unable to stand. Dario stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, jaw locked, eyes sweeping over the chaos like a general watching his army fall apart before the battle even started. Pots sat half-prepared, sauces were unfinished, and the guests, men who did not forgive weakness, men who read the slightest hesitation as an insult, were already turning up the driveway. "Call every restaurant in the city," he snapped. "I don't care what it costs." "Sir, there's no time," the housekeeper said. "Nothing will get here before I can cook it." The voice came from the hallway. Soft, but certain. Serena Fontaine stood there in a plain green dress, sleeves already pushed up to her elbows, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment her whole life. She was not what people pictured when they imagined a crime boss's wife. She was warm-faced, round, completely unbothered by the beauty rules that ruled every other woman in Dario's world. She smiled too much for a house so full of danger. She hummed while she walked, and right now, she was looking at her husband like this whole disaster was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Dario almost laughed. Almost. "This isn't a joke, Serena. These are not people you disappoint." "I'm not joking." Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "Give me the kitchen. Give me 40 minutes. You've never cooked anything past pasta and scrambled eggs in your life." Something flickered behind her eyes. Not hurt, not anger, something closer to quiet amusement, like she knew a secret he didn't. "You've never asked me to cook anything else." There was no time to argue. The gates were already swinging open. Headlights swept across the courtyard. "Do it," Dario said, already regretting it. "If this goes wrong, it's on both our heads." The housekeeper hesitated for barely a second before stepping aside, and Serena walked past her husband without another word, tied her hair back, and disappeared into the kitchen like she was marching into battle. For the next 38 minutes, Dario sat at the head of the table, making conversation he'd barely remember later, his whole mind fixed on the kitchen doors. He heard clattering. He heard something sizzle. He smelled garlic, then rosemary, then something rich and smoky that made even his most stone-faced captain glance toward the kitchen mid-sentence. And then the doors opened. Plates came out, one after another. Not the stiff, over-decorated food his chef usually served, but dishes that looked like they belonged in somebody's grandmother's kitchen. Rustic bread, still steaming. A stew so dark and fragrant that one guest closed his eyes before he'd even tasted it. Roasted vegetables glazed in something sweet and smoky. And a seafood risotto so good that Don Matteo Colombo, a man famous for never complimenting anything, set down his fork and simply said, "Who made this?" Silence spread across the table. Dario opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was too busy watching his men, hardened enforcers and cold negotiators, eating like they were kids at their mothers' tables again. His loyal underboss, a man named Renzo, wasn't even talking business anymore. He was asking for the recipe. "My wife," Dario finally said, because there was no other answer. Serena stepped into the dining room a moment later, cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove, apron still tied around her waist. She gave a small, humble smile, as if she hadn't just saved her husband from total humiliation in front of the most dangerous men in the city. "I hope it was enough," she said simply. Nobody answered with words. They answered by asking for seconds. By the time the last guest left that night, no threats had been made. No tension had cracked into violence. And for the first time in years, Dario Fontaine walked into his bedroom not thinking about power or enemies or war. He was thinking about his wife, the woman he'd underestimated for their entire marriage, and wondering, for the very first time, who she really was. He had no idea this was only the beginning. Word travels fast in a house full of watchful eyes, and by sunrise everyone in the mansion had heard some version of what happened at dinner. The guards whispered about it at the gates. The maids repeated it while making beds. Even the mechanics in the garage joked that the boss's wife had tamed 5 crime lords with a single bowl of risotto. Serena heard the whispers too. She just didn't react the way anyone expected. Instead of sleeping in and soaking up the praise, she was up before the sun, tying on her apron in the same kitchen that had nearly caused a catastrophe the night before. By the time the guards changed shifts at 6, the smell of fresh bread and simmering coffee had already drifted across the courtyard. "Ma'am, you don't have to do this," the housekeeper said, catching her sliding a tray of pastries out of the oven. "The staff have their own meals." "I know I don't have to." Serena wiped her hands on her apron, smiling like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I want to." She carried the first tray out herself, walking straight to the guards at the front gate, men who rarely got more than a nod from anyone in the family, and she knew their names before they told her. She'd asked the housekeeper the night before, staying up an extra hour just to learn who worked in the house and what they liked to eat. "Enzo, right? I heard you don't like tomatoes, so I made yours without the sauce," she said, handing a plate to a broad-shouldered guard who looked like he hadn't cracked a smile in years. Enzo blinked, genuinely unsure how to react to being remembered. "Thank you, Mom." And she moved through the whole estate like that all morning. Gardeners, cleaners, the mechanics working on a car in the garage, even the 2 men posted at the far wall who nobody bothered feeding until midday. She learned who had someone waiting at home, who missed their mother's cooking, who hadn't had a proper breakfast in weeks because they were too scared to ask. By the second day, something strange started happening. Guards who used to stand in dead silence started talking to each other over breakfast. Cleaners who used to rush through their shifts started showing up early just to catch the smell of fresh bread. Even the mechanics, men who barely looked up from their engines, started taking their coffee breaks together instead of alone. Dario noticed it before anyone told him. He noticed it in the way his men moved. Sharper, more alert, working like they actually wanted to be there instead of just obeying out of fear. Loyalty built on fear was reliable, sure, but it was cold. This felt different. This felt warm. And warmth was something Dario had never trusted in his line of work. "You should be careful," Renzo said one afternoon, watching from the study window as Serena laughed with 2 guards near the courtyard fountain, plates of food balanced between them. Renzo had been at Dario's side for over 15 years, his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor, and the one man who always told him the truth, even when he didn't want to hear it. "Careful of what? My wife feeding my staff? Careful of what she's building." Renzo turned to face him, unusually serious. "Fear keeps men in line, Dario. It's simple, predictable. But this is something else. She's making them love her. And loyalty built on love doesn't answer to threats. It doesn't answer to money. It answers to her." Dario waved it off the way he waved off most things that didn't involve an immediate threat. "She's cooking breakfast, Renzo, not raising an army." "Maybe not on purpose." Renzo's eyes stayed fixed on the courtyard, where one of the toughest guards in the whole family was now teaching Serena how to skip a stone across the fountain, both of them laughing like old friends. But look at them, and ask yourself this. If you ordered one of those men to do something Serena disagreed with, who do you honestly think they'd listen to? The question hung heavy in the room, and for the first time, Dario didn't have an easy answer. That night, he found her in the kitchen again, humming to herself as she washed the last of the dishes, even though the staff had offered to do it for her a dozen times. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Cooking for everyone. It's not your job." She turned, drying her hands on a towel, that same calm, knowing smile on her face. Feeding people isn't a job, Dario. It's how you tell someone they matter. Most of the people in this house have never been told that. Not once in their whole lives. He didn't respond right away. He thought about the guards laughing over breakfast, the mechanics taking their time, the quiet loyalty spreading through his household like something he couldn't control or even fully explain. He didn't know it yet, but his wife wasn't just feeding his empire. She was quietly becoming its heart. By the end of that first week, Serena had burned through nearly everything the mansion's expensive suppliers could offer. The imported truffles, the rare cheeses flown in from overseas, the perfectly uniform vegetables that showed up in crates every morning. None of it tasted right to her. "These tomatoes have no soul," she muttered one morning, poking at a crate from one of Dario's usual vendors. "I need real ingredients. I need the market." "Which market?" the housekeeper asked. "The old Riverside one, where I grew up." Dario wasn't thrilled about it. The Riverside market sat outside his usual territory, in a part of the city he didn't fully control. But after a week of watching his household completely transform under his wife's cooking, he'd learned not to argue with her instincts. He assigned a small security team, 4 men led by Enzo, the same guard she'd remembered on that first morning, and let her go. And the moment the car pulled up to the market, something shifted in Serena. She stepped out slowly, her eyes moving over the narrow stalls, the fruit stacked in wooden crates, the smell of fresh fish and baking bread thick in the morning air. This wasn't just a market to her. It was home. "Serena, little Serena, is that you?" An elderly woman selling herbs nearly dropped her basket, rushing over with tears already welling up. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. Shopkeepers who remembered her as a girl trailing after her grandmother through these same narrow paths, learning to pick the ripest peaches and the freshest fish by scent alone. "Your grandmother would be so proud," the herb seller said, squeezing her hands. "She always said you had her gift." Serena smiled, but something in her chest tightened as she walked deeper in. Familiar faces were missing. Stalls she remembered from childhood stood empty, shutters rusted shut. And when she asked about them, the answers came in careful, lowered voices. "Extortion," one vendor admitted quietly, glancing nervously at Enzo and the other guards standing a few feet away, clearly having no idea they worked for the very world causing all this pain. "Different crews than your husband's, but they all want a cut. Poor old Thomas lost his bakery 2 months ago. Couldn't keep up with the payments." Serena's easy smile faded, replaced by something sharper. A quiet, focused determination Dario had never seen in her. She spent the rest of the morning going stall to stall, not just buying vegetables and fish, but listening. She learned which families were drowning in debt, which businesses were one bad week from closing forever, which elderly shopkeepers had nobody left to help them. And by midday, instead of heading home, she asked Enzo to take her to a small office 2 streets over, a legitimate business consultancy Dario occasionally used for legal work. "I want to buy out some debts," she told the confused clerk quietly, "through proper contracts. No mention of my husband's name." Over the next 2 hours, using money from her own personal accounts, Serena arranged to pay off the debts of 3 struggling vendors, structuring each one as a small business loan with generous terms instead of charity. Enough to save their pride while saving their livelihoods. And when she finally came back to collect the fresh ingredients she needed, old Thomas the baker stopped her near his stall. his eyes red and glassy. "They told me somebody paid off what I owed," he said, his voice trembling. "Said it came through some office downtown. I didn't believe it until I saw the papers myself." Serena said nothing, keeping her face carefully neutral, even as her heart pounded. Tomas studied her for a long moment, then slowly began to smile. "Your grandmother used to feed the children in this market every winter, you know. Never took a coin for it. Used to say kindness was the only investment that never lost its value." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You've got her eyes, Serena. Always did." That evening, as the car wound back up the hill toward the mansion, Serena sat quiet in the back seat, bags of fresh vegetables and fish and herbs stacked around her feet. Enzo caught her eye in the rearview mirror. "Ma'am, did something happen back there, at the consultancy office?" "Just paperwork," she said simply, staring out at the city lights flickering to life below. Enzo didn't push, but he'd already seen the tearful thank yous, the way half the market had stopped what they were doing just to hug her goodbye. He said nothing to Dario that night. Somehow it felt like something that wasn't his to tell. But he'd remember it. Because whatever kind of woman Serena Fontaine truly was, she was clearly far more than anyone in that mansion had ever bothered to notice. 4 days after the market trip, a phone call dragged Dario out of bed before dawn. "It's Marco," Renzo said, his voice tight. "The ambush left him alive, but barely. He's been at the countryside safe house 6 days now. Won't eat, won't talk to anyone. Doctor says his body's healing fine. He's just shutting down." Marco was one of Dario's most trusted captains, a man who'd survived 2 decades in this business, without flinching, without hesitating, without ever once showing weakness. Losing him wasn't just about losing a soldier, it was about losing a man Dario genuinely respected. "I'm going," Dario said, already reaching for his coat. "I'm coming too," Serena said from the doorway, already dressed, a woven basket in her hands. Dario opened his mouth to argue, then stopped himself. He'd learned enough over the past 2 weeks to know better. The drive out took nearly 3 hours, winding through quiet countryside far from the noise of the city. When they arrived, the place felt more like an abandoned farmhouse than a hideout. Wooden shutters, a stone fireplace, and an eerie silence that made the isolation press heavier with every step. Marco sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm afternoon, staring at nothing. His face was pale, his cheeks hollow from days of barely eating. The guard stationed with him looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes from trying and failing to get his captain to respond to anything. "Marco," Dario said, his voice gentler than usual. The man barely reacted, just a slow blink. Serena didn't say a word. She simply walked past both men, straight into the little kitchen, and started unpacking her basket. Fresh bread from a village bakery they'd passed on the drive, a handful of vegetables, dried herbs, and a small clay pot she'd brought from home. She didn't ask Marco what he wanted. She didn't try to force him to talk. She just started cooking, filling the quiet farmhouse with the sound of chopping and simmering, the smell of garlic and rosemary slowly drifting through the rooms. An hour later, she carried 2 bowls to the small table by the fireplace and sat down across from him, setting one gently in front of him. It was nothing fancy, just a simple vegetable stew, the kind of meal a mother might make for a sick child. "You don't have to eat it," she said quietly. "I just didn't want you sitting here alone." She picked up her own spoon and started eating, unbothered by his silence, humming softly the way she always did. Dario stood near the doorway, watching, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it entirely. Minutes passed. Marco stared at the bowl, steam curling up into the cool afternoon air, and then, slowly, almost like his body was moving without his say-so, he picked up the spoon. He ate in silence at first. Then, somewhere between the second and third spoonful, his hand started to shake. "I keep seeing him," Marco said suddenly, his voice raw and cracked like it hadn't been used in days. "My brother. He was standing right next to me when the shots came. I pulled him down. Too late. Serena didn't flinch. She didn't offer empty comfort. She just set down her spoon and listened, her eyes steady and warm, the same way she'd listened to every struggling shopkeeper at the market. He was 17, Marco went on, the tears finally breaking loose after days of holding them back. Wanted nothing to do with this life. I promised our mother I'd protect him. I promised. You didn't fail him, Serena said softly. You survived so you could carry his memory forward. That's not failure, Marco. That's love. And Dario stood frozen by the door, watching a man he'd known for 15 years, a man who had never once shown a crack of vulnerability in front of him, finally fall apart in front of his wife, over nothing more than a bowl of stew and a few gentle words. By the time they left that evening, Marco had eaten 2 full bowls and drifted into the first real sleep he'd had in almost a week. In the car heading back, Dario sat quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. I've had doctors, interrogators, even a priest try to reach him. Nothing worked. They were all trying to fix him, Serena said, watching the dark countryside slide past her window. I just wanted him to feel less alone. And Dario looked at his wife in a whole new light that night. Not as the woman he'd underestimated. Not even as the woman quietly winning the loyalty of his household. But as someone with a gift he was only beginning to understand. She didn't just feed people. She reached places inside them that fear, power, and money could never touch. Now there was a small farming village at the base of the hills that held a harvest festival every single year, rain or shine, a humble little celebration where struggling families gathered to share whatever food they could scrape together, which some years wasn't much at all. Serena had heard about it from one of the market vendors. I want to help, she told the housekeeper one morning, spreading a map across the kitchen table. Quietly, no mention of the family name. Over the next few days, she arranged the whole thing herself. She bought produce straight from local farmers, paying well above market price without haggling. She recruited a handful of kitchen staff willing to spend a day cooking off the estate, promising them double pay and, more importantly, a chance to be part of something that had nothing to do with business or fear. On the morning of the festival, Serena showed up in a plain dress with her hair tied back, completely indistinguishable from any other woman setting up a food stall. She and her small team worked from sunrise, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, warm stews, simple food made with care instead of extravagance. Families lined up all day, many of them thin, many of them worn out from a hard season, but all of them leaving with full plates and, for a few hours, lighter hearts. Children ran laughing between the tables. Old villagers sat together swapping stories over bowls of soup. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Serena felt like she was doing exactly what she was meant to do. Nobody in that crowd knew who she really was. That was the whole point. This wasn't about her husband's reputation or the family name. This was just about feeding people who needed it. But not everyone lurking in the shadows shared that innocence. 2 men hanging around the edge of the festival, informants working loosely for a rival organization, recognized one of the security guards standing quietly near the food tables. And it didn't take long for word to travel back to their boss that members of Dario Fontaine's crew had been spotted funding, or at least protecting, some kind of charity event outside their territory. By the time the festival wound down that night, the story had already twisted into something far uglier than the truth. Rumors spread through the underworld that the Fontaine family was secretly buying loyalty in struggling villages, expanding their influence under the cover of charity, quietly preparing to challenge rival territory from the ground up. Dario heard about it 2 days later, called into an urgent meeting by Renzo, whose face alone told him something was wrong. People are talking, Renzo said, sliding a folder across the desk. Word is you're funding community events outside your territory. Some are calling it a soft invasion. Bastian Corvo's people are already asking questions. Dario's stomach tightened at that name. Bastian Corvo. a rival boss known for his volatile temper and his hunger to grab new territory by any means necessary. "It wasn't me," Dario admitted quietly. "It was Serena." Renzo's eyebrows went up, but he said nothing, letting the weight of it settle between them. That night, Dario found Serena in the kitchen, exhausted but glowing from the day's work, humming as she scrubbed the last of the festival pots. "You didn't tell me you were doing this," he said, not with anger, but concern. "I didn't think I needed permission to feed hungry families," she replied, not looking up from the sink. "It's not about permission." Dario rubbed his temples, choosing his words carefully. "It's about how it looks. Rival families think we're trying to buy loyalty in territory that isn't ours. This could start a war, Serena. A real one." And for the first time since he'd known her, Serena looked genuinely stunned. Her hands stilled in the soapy water, her easy smile fading into something uncertain. "I just wanted to help." "I know." Dario stepped closer, gently taking her hands from the sink, something softening in his usually guarded face. "But in our world, kindness looks like strategy to people who've never once experienced it honestly." Serena stared down at their joined hands, the weight of it all settling heavy on her shoulders. She'd wanted nothing more than to give struggling families a good meal and a few hours of peace. Instead, without meaning to, she'd planted a seed of suspicion that was about to grow into something far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. And neither of them knew it yet, but Bastian Corvo was already making plans of his own. Plans that would soon turn Serena's quiet kindness into the very thing that put her life at risk. Bastian Corvo had built his whole reputation on being unpredictable. Where other bosses relied on careful planning and patience, Bastian preferred fear delivered fast and loud. When his informants reported that Dario Fontaine's wife was quietly winning over villages outside their territory, feeding families, saving businesses, turning hardened guards into devoted followers with nothing but kindness, Bastian didn't see a harmless woman with a big heart. He saw a weapon. "She's the weak point," he told his lieutenant, pacing his study. "Dario doesn't fear losing his territory. He fears losing her. You can see it in the way his men talk about her." "So we take her?" "No." Bastian shook his head, a slow, calculated smile spreading. "We take what she's building, destroy the thing she loves, and we send a message without ever laying a finger on his precious wife. Clean, untraceable, and it'll break something in him a bullet never could." His target was Serena's next project, a small community kitchen she'd started building on the edge of the village, meant to run year-round instead of just during the festival. It was still under construction, funded quietly out of her own accounts, staffed by volunteers who'd grown to adore her over the past weeks. Bastian's men moved in on a quiet afternoon, timing it for when they figured the building would be empty of anyone important. They were almost right. Serena was there that day with 3 volunteers, finishing the last touches on the new stove, laughing over some joke about burnt bread, when Enzo, posted outside as a precaution, burst through the door with real urgency. "Ma'am, we need to leave, now." Something in his voice left no room for questions. Serena gathered the volunteers immediately, and within minutes they were in the car, pulling away, tires kicking up dust down the narrow village road. They were barely a quarter-mile out when Enzo glanced in the mirror and saw the first flames rising behind them. By the time Dario's men arrived to secure the area that evening, the community kitchen Serena had spent weeks building was little more than smoking rubble. The new stove destroyed, the walls scorched black. Months of careful work reduced to ash in under an hour. Serena stood at the edge of the wreckage that night, silent, staring at what was left of a place meant to bring warmth to a struggling village. Dario stood beside her, fury simmering just under his controlled surface, his hand tightening into a fist. "This was Bastian," he said quietly. "It has to be. I'll handle this tonight." "No." Serena turned to look at him, and he was surprised by the firmness in her voice. Her eyes were wet, but there was no fear in them, only a steady, unshakable resolve. "You want to burn down half his territory in return. I know how this works, Dario. I've watched you and Renzo plan things like this, but that's not what these people need right now. Serena, he attacked a building, she interrupted gently, laying a hand on his arm. Not a person. Nobody was hurt. But if you hit back the way you want to, people will get hurt. Innocent people, families in that village who have nothing to do with any of this. Dario stared at her, torn between the instinct that had kept him alive for decades and the quiet wisdom radiating from the woman beside him. Then what do you want me to do instead? He asked, his voice rough with restrained anger. Rebuild it, she said simply. First, before anything else. Show Bastian that burning down kindness doesn't destroy it. It only makes it stronger. Let him see that fear didn't work. Renzo, standing a few feet off, shot Dario a look, clearly expecting him to dismiss the whole idea. Instead, Dario went quiet for a long moment, staring at the smoking ruins of the kitchen his wife had built with nothing but good intentions and hard work. Rebuild it, he finally said, turning to Renzo. Bigger this time, and find out exactly which of Bastian's men did this. Quietly. We'll deal with them later. But Serena's right about one thing. His eyes softened as he looked at his wife. This isn't about revenge tonight. It's about making sure he understands he can't burn away what she's built. Bastian Corvo had expected fear, chaos, and immediate retaliation. What he got instead, 3 days later, was the news that the Fontaine family had rebuilt the community kitchen twice as large, staffed by even more volunteers than before, standing as a quiet, defiant symbol that his attack had utterly failed. His miscalculation was only just starting to cost him. Now, with the kitchen rebuild underway, Serena found herself short on equipment. Proper pots, cast iron pans, the specific tools her grandmother had once used to cook for the whole market. Most of it had been lost or sold years ago, but she remembered one place that might still have what she needed. My grandmother's cottage, she told Dario one morning. It's been empty since she passed. There might be things left in the kitchen we could use. The cottage sat nearly 2 hours outside the city, tucked into the countryside near the edge of a small forest, forgotten by time and overgrown with wild ivy. Dario insisted on coming himself this time, unwilling to send his wife somewhere so isolated after the fire. Inside, the cottage smelled of dust and old wood, sunlight filtering through grimy windows onto furniture draped in white sheets. Serena moved through the rooms, slowly, memories clearly rising with every step. The worn table where she'd learned to knead dough as a child, the little chair by the window where her grandmother used to sit, shelling peas in the evenings. She always said this floor creaked in the exact same spot, Serena murmured, stepping carefully across the kitchen. And sure enough, one particular board groaned loudly under her foot, different from the rest. She knelt and ran her fingers along its edge and noticed it wasn't nailed down like the others. Dario, help me with this. Together they pried the board free, revealing a small hollow underneath. Inside sat a thick leather journal, its cover worn soft with age, tied shut with a faded ribbon. Serena's hands trembled as she lifted it out and brushed away years of dust. She untied the ribbon and opened the first page, her breath catching as she recognized her grandmother's handwriting. Slanted and elegant, filling every line. And it wasn't just a recipe book. It was something far more personal. Alongside detailed recipes for stews and bread and roasted vegetables, her grandmother had written stories, short entries beside nearly every dish, describing the people she'd cooked for and why. For the Alvarez family. 3 sons. Father lost his job at the mill, made extra bread this week. For old Mateo, grieving his wife of 40 years, cooked her favorite soup, sat with him while he ate. For the little girl who never speaks, brought her sweets after her mother's funeral. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Page after page, Serena's grandmother had recorded not just what she'd cooked, but who she'd helped, why they'd needed it, and how a simple meal had quietly changed something in each of them. Dario read over her shoulder in silence, watching decades of quiet, unglamorous kindness unfold across the yellowed pages. This wasn't charity done for reputation. This was a woman who had spent her entire life feeding people simply because she understood that a warm meal could reach places words never could. She never told anyone about this, Serena whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. She just did it, every single day, for anyone who needed it. And near the back, one entry stopped Dario cold. For my granddaughter, Serena. She has my hands and my heart, though she doesn't know it yet. One day she'll understand that feeding someone isn't about the food. It's about telling them, without words, that they matter. I hope she never forgets that, no matter what life brings her. Dario looked up from the page and studied his wife in a way he'd never allowed himself to before. Not as the woman he'd married for convenience and family alliances all those years ago, but as someone carrying forward a legacy far older and more powerful than anything he'd ever built with fear. "This is why," he said quietly. "This is why you believe a shared meal can build something fear never could." Serena nodded, closing the journal gently, holding it to her chest like something sacred. "My grandmother never had power the way you understand it, Dario. No money, no army, no territory. But everyone in that market loved her. Everyone trusted her. And that kind of loyalty doesn't vanish the second someone stops being afraid." Dario sat on that dusty cottage floor for a long time afterward, turning over something that had never once occurred to him, that everything he'd built through fear and control might be fundamentally fragile, while everything his wife built through warmth and honesty seemed to only grow stronger the more it was tested. By the time they left that evening, carrying old cooking equipment and, more importantly, that journal, Dario Fontaine had begun quietly questioning something he'd never dared question before. Maybe fear wasn't the only way to build an empire that lasted. The tension Serena had accidentally sparked hadn't faded. If anything, it had sharpened. Bastian's failed attack had embarrassed him in front of his own men, and embarrassed men in his line of work rarely let things go. Rumors of retaliation rippled through the underworld, and other families, sensing instability, began quietly picking sides. It was Renzo who finally brought the warning to Dario's study, graver than usual. "It's escalating. 3 other families are getting nervous. If Bastian makes another move, this won't stay contained. We're talking about a full territorial war. Dozens of families caught in the crossfire." A neutral summit was arranged within days, mediated by older, more established bosses who had no interest in watching the whole region collapse into chaos. The meeting would happen at an isolated lakeside vineyard, neutral ground for generations. Everyone attending expected exactly what these things always were: tension, careful words, and the constant unspoken threat of violence simmering underneath. Serena had other plans. "Let me handle the food," she told Dario the night before. "This isn't a dinner party," he said carefully. "These men might be trying to finish each other by the end of the night." "That's exactly why it needs to be a good meal," she replied, already pulling out ingredient lists. "Fear makes men defensive. Shared food makes them remember they're human before they're enemies." Dario didn't fully believe it would work, but after everything he'd witnessed over the past month, he no longer had the confidence to tell her she was wrong. The vineyard sat quiet and golden in the late afternoon sun as the families began arriving, security details bristling with barely hidden weapons, eyes scanning every corner. Long tables had been set up in the courtyard, and the moment guests stepped out of their cars, they were met not with the usual stiff formality of these gatherings, but with the rich, warm smell of food that tugged at something deeper than caution. Serena had spent days researching each family's heritage, preparing dishes that echoed the childhoods of men who'd long since buried their softness under ambition. Sicilian seafood stew for the Colombo family, slow-roasted lamb with herbs for the Albanos, who traced their roots to the countryside hills, and fresh, simple bread for Bastian Corvo himself, the exact recipe his own grandmother had once made, something Serena had learned through careful, quiet questions weeks earlier. One by one, as the meal went on, something shifted in that courtyard. Don Mateo Colombo found himself reminiscing loudly about his mother's kitchen, laughing in a way none of his men had seen in years. Bastian Corvo, cold and guarded at first, went quiet when he tasted the bread, his sharp expression melting into something unreadable as old memories clearly surfaced. For nearly 2 hours, business was barely mentioned. Old rivals traded stories about the time before ambition and territory had turned them into enemies. And then, just as the tension finally seemed to break, chaos erupted. 3 men nobody recognized appeared near the vineyard's edge, weapons drawn, clearly hoping to use the gathering's relaxed guard to wipe out multiple rival bosses in one strike, almost certainly hired by someone looking to profit off the resulting war. For one terrifying moment, tables overturned, guards scrambled for their weapons, and the peaceful courtyard teetered on the edge of a bloodbath. But then, something unexpected happened. Bodyguards from different rival families, men who had spent the whole evening eating side by side, laughing over shared childhood memories, instinctively moved together instead of scattering to protect only their own bosses. Enzo tackled one attacker before he could fire a second shot. 2 Colombo guards, who'd been chatting with Bastian's men minutes earlier, blocked another gunman from reaching the tables where the cooks and villagers stood frozen in terror. Within moments, all 3 attackers were subdued, disarmed, and dragged away, the danger neutralized before it could claim a single life. Silence fell over the courtyard as the dust settled, every boss present staring at each other with a strange, unspoken understanding. If not for that unusual unity between rival guards, this gathering could have ended in a massacre. Bastian Corvo, breathing hard, looked across the wreckage of overturned tables towards Serena, who stood protectively in front of the terrified kitchen staff, having pulled 2 of them behind her without a second thought for her own safety. "You did this," he said quietly, and for the first time there was no accusation in his voice. "Whatever this was tonight, this unity." "I just made dinner," Serena replied simply. The negotiations resumed an hour later, calmer and more honest than anyone had expected, the shared danger somehow accomplishing what careful diplomacy never could. By the end of the night, an agreement was reached, a fragile peace, but a real one, built not through threats or violence, but through a single shared meal and the unexpected loyalty it had quietly planted among men who'd arrived as enemies. And Dario watched his wife across the courtyard as the last guests left, understanding now, without a single doubt, exactly what kind of woman he had married. 3 days after that summit, word had spread through every family in the region, not just about the peace, but about the strange, quiet miracle that had stopped a war before it could start. Men who'd spent decades building empires on fear now spoke about Serena Fontaine in hushed, almost reverent tones, the woman who stopped a massacre with nothing but bread and shared memories. And Dario had spent those 3 days thinking, really thinking, in a way he rarely let himself, about that first dinner, about Marco finally eating after days of silence, about the market vendors who wept at her grandmother's name, about the journal hidden beneath a floorboard filled with decades of quiet, unglamorous love, and about how wrong he had been. On the 4th morning, he asked the housekeeper to gather everyone, every guard, gardener, mechanic, cleaner, and cook, in the courtyard by noon. Serena, busy in the kitchen making lunch as usual, had no idea what was happening until Enzo gently told her the boss was asking for her out by the fountain. She stepped outside, apron still on, flour dusted across one cheek, and stopped short at the sight. The entire household stood gathered in the courtyard. Nearly 60 people, every single soul who worked or lived on that estate, all turned toward her with an expression she'd never seen aimed her way before. Not politeness, not obligation. Something closer to devotion. And Dario stood at the center. For a man known throughout the underworld for his ice-cold composure, he looked, for the first time in years, genuinely nervous. "When I married Serena," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I'll admit something I'm not proud of. I looked at her and saw someone soft, someone who didn't fit into this world of mine, a world built on fear, control, and power. I underestimated her because of how she looked. because I assumed kindness was a weakness. He paused, glancing at his wife, whose eyes were already filling with tears. I was wrong, completely wrong. He turned to the crowd, gesturing at the guards who had once been strangers to each other, now standing shoulder to shoulder like old friends. Every one of you knows what she's done these past weeks. She learned your names, your struggles. She fed you when nobody else thought to ask if you'd even eaten. She saved businesses that meant nothing to my empire but everything to the people who built them. She sat with a broken man when doctors and priests couldn't reach him. She stopped a war with a single dinner. His voice caught slightly, something raw slipping through his usual control. I built this house with fear. I built an empire men respected because they were afraid not to. But my wife... He looked directly at Serena now, his expression softer than anyone present had ever witnessed. My wife turned this house into a home. She gave all of you something I never could. She gave you a reason to stay that has nothing to do with money or fear. The courtyard was silent for a long moment. And then Renzo, near the front, began to clap. Slowly the sound spread. Guards, cooks, gardeners, everyone joining in until the applause echoed off the mansion walls, warm and genuine in a way the estate had never known. Serena crossed the courtyard and stood before her husband, tears streaming freely now, no longer bothering to hide them. "You didn't have to say all that," she whispered. "Yes, I did." Dario took her hands in his. The same hands that had built an empire through calculated ruthlessness, now holding hers with something far gentler. "I spent years thinking power meant being feared. You taught me that real power is being trusted enough that people choose to protect what you've built, even when no one's watching, even when fear isn't forcing them to." That evening, the whole household gathered for a feast unlike anything the mansion had ever seen, not made by Serena alone this time, but by dozens of hands working together. Guards who'd learned her recipes helped chop vegetables. Cooks who'd once worked in tense silence laughed together over simmering pots. Even Marco, fully recovered and finally smiling again, showed up to help carry dishes to the long tables set beneath the stars. And Dario sat at the head of the table that night, watching his household, no, his family now, share food and stories and laughter long into the evening. He thought about everything that had happened since that first chaotic dinner. The market, the safe house, the kitchen burned down and rebuilt twice as strong, the journal beneath the floorboard, the peace forged over a meal that had nearly ended in bloodshed. Fear had built his empire brick by brick, year after year. But watching Serena now, surrounded by people who loved her not because they had to, but because she'd shown every single one of them, in the simplest way possible, that they mattered. Dario finally understood the truth his wife had known all along. Kindness was the only thing strong enough to make people willingly protect it, long after fear had lost its power. And for the first time in his life, Dario Fontaine wasn't afraid of that at all. So here's what I want to leave you with. We're taught that power comes from being feared, from control, from strength, from making sure nobody dares cross you. But this story flips that whole idea on its head. Real, lasting loyalty isn't something you can threaten out of people. It's something you earn. One warm meal, one remembered name, one act of quiet kindness at a time. Serena never threw a punch or fired a shot. She just made people feel like they mattered. And that turned out to be the most powerful force in the entire region. Now I'd genuinely love to hear from you. Do you think kindness really can outlast fear the way it did in this story? Or do you think Dario got lucky? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I read everyone. If this story warmed your heart even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button. It truly helps more than you'd think. Share it with someone who believes a good meal can change everything. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the next one. I'll see you there. And hey, go make somebody a good dinner tonight.